LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Sunlit world of what he believes to be reality. But there is, unseen by most, an underworld, a place that is just as real, but not as brightly lit.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and today we present part 2 of our interview with Colin E. Davis and Melissa Murray, who join us once again to discuss their book, Shadow Tech, Cracking the Codes of Personal and Collective Darkness. In the follow-up to our first interview, we further discuss the nature of evil as a non-local force communicable across the energetic field which exists between individuals, groups, and entire species. It is the shadow side of the human psyche, known down the ages as demons, evil spirits, and possession, amongst other things. It is viral and parasitic in nature, operating within the biological computer, the hardware of the body, and the software of the mind. Human culture, therefore, is like a computer network, and deep within it, politics, economics, the media, and every tentacle of our tremulous civilization twists and tortures our subconscious. We are, however, not completely helpless. In acknowledging what ails us and summoning the courage to confront it, we have at least a chance of cutting out this cancer before it kills the host. Hello and welcome, Colin and Melissa. Thanks once again for joining us on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Hi, Greg.
Hi, Greg. Thanks
nice
a lot.
Here.
Yeah, we're really enjoying this.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned enjoying. We've already done part 1 of this chat. Today we're presenting part 2, discussing some of the concepts in your book, Shadow Tech, Cracking the Codes of Personal and Collective Darkness. Now, if people haven't heard part 1, and I suggest that they do before listening to this, they'll find the link at legalize-freedom.com. On the page, this interview page, you'll find a link to part 1. If folks are listening to this on YouTube, you may find the link to part 1 on the suggested videos down the right-hand side. If you don't, then you need to get yourself over, as I say, to legalize-freedom.com. You'll find both parts there. As I mentioned, we're talking about your book, Shadow Tech. We've delved into a lot of information, a lot of depth in part 1. Today, we're going to try and draw out some more details and explore some more of the core themes. Essentially, we were discussing the concept of evil last time, amongst other things. Mm-hmm. Does it exist? Can we put a face, a name to this thing? And we're talking about it in the context of human nature, our sort of essential Jekyll and Hyde aspect, our enormous capacity for creativity, but also destruction, and for compassion, but also cruelty. And in the book, you get into something, and I know that we've both mentioned a guy called Paul Levy. Mm-hmm. He was an interview subject of mine, and you know him, so we're both familiar with his work. Mm-hmm. And I don't know about you, but that's where I first came across the idea of someone trying to put a face on evil and talk about the viral and kind of parasitical nature of it. So I know you believe this to be really, really key, and in fact it is, because it brings evil. We're going to stick with that, even if people feel it's a bit esoteric and mystic, it brings it into the physical realm in a way that begins to make it easier to grasp. So I'll just open it up for you guys to talk about that aspect of the work and just take it where you want. Yeah, so you've got the floor.
Yeah, you're right about that, Greg. Paul Levy is someone who I think has described evil in this context very well, and he does relate. He says that he uses the Cree Indian term wetiko, which meant evil spirit, and he talks about how that you could see evil as a non-local parasitic force, and that it's communicable, kind of like a virus. And I recommend his work to anybody who's interested in this. And he explains it very poetically and very deeply. There's another author, many people know the spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle, and he also has talked about destruction, human destructiveness, in this context of parasitism. And he has a concept called the pain body. And it's in his second book, the fifth and sixth chapters, I think are really well done. And it's interesting that he has, I think, such a well-rounded understanding of how the destructive force in the human psyche works parasitically, and yet not too many people know that aspect of his work. It's conveniently ignored. So those are two authors whose work aligns with ours, and there's some others. There's even the fictional work of
Colin Wilson, actually.
Right.
I had seen that book years ago, and I started to read it, but then when we started to do this research, we started watching our own thoughts, watching our own cycles. Then we kind of ran into Paul Levy's work, and then it just we had synchronistic happenings that kind of built this research from there. But I reread Colin Wilson's book, Mind Parasites, and we know it's supposed to be science fiction, but the experiences that the characters in that book had were very, very similar to what we were also noticing.
That's true.
It was very interesting. And there's one other guy who talks about mind parasites who's done some work on it, and that's Jonathan Zapp. And so you can look up his work on the same subject too.
Yeah, and so basically what happened with us is we started to find these other people's work, and it was coinciding with our own investigation of our own shadows, of our own destructive tendencies, our own destructive cycles that we had all of our lives, like everyone has, and we were really trying to. We were really every time Melissa and I had some kind of a fight between us, or every time we had some kind of a destructive mood cycle, or any kind of a destructive cycle, we would try to track it and trace it and understand it and trace it back into our childhoods, and we would try to notice the feelings and the thoughts that surrounded these different places in the cycle. Like it's a good way to study this is when you have a relationship with somebody. It could be anybody. It could be a spouse, or it could be a good friend or a family member, and you know that you get into these habitual destructive cycles like arguments or fights around certain issues, and you start to look closely at them. You'll find that in your own body, you will find that you are harboring a certain energy before the cycle ever starts. And then the cycle will start, and it will bring up a whole bunch of new energy of anger or energy of victimhood or whatever it is, and the cycle will play out, and then you will feel a different energy when you're coming down off of the argument or whatever, and there will be a whole cycle of chemicals, of endorphins, of emotional moods and thoughts that that surround any kind of a destructive cycle. It could be also an addictive cycle. It doesn't matter what it is. We started to use these opportunities to study these cycles and then to try to relate them to other people's work, and including, like, for example, Paul Levy's work. But then I just started to go study how parasites and viruses work in biology. I just started opening biology books and looking online and starting to understand, okay, so what are these things? What are these entities? What is their history? How do they work? And the whole thing behind them. And what we found through studying parasites and viruses in biology is that the life cycle of a parasite, very typically, or of a virus, it very much coincides with the life cycle of a destructive cycle within one's own life. And also it coincides with destructive cultural cycles. Destructive cycles like destructive race relations or political cycles, all kinds of different destructive cycles in the human domain seem to relate very closely to parasitic cycles in nature. And so that's what kind of got us into that whole thing. And we started to find that Eckhart Tolle and Paul Levy's understanding was very accurate. And then we started to try to go deeper into this and say, well, how would this work? And over a period of a couple of years, we sort of formed a model for how you could see the shadow of the human psyche as it relates to biological parasitism. And if you want, Melissa could comment on this, and then I could describe for you a model of how you might be able to see your own psyche, your own mind, in terms of these parasitic cycles in a way that might make some sense.
I would just add that we started using, as he said, our own cycles of dysfunction as a experiment, as actually studying this so that we could come to a fuller understanding of this. One of the things that we did was just a lot of mindfulness practices where we would just be watching our thoughts at every point during the day. And we would notice these just random destructive thoughts that would just like pop into our heads. Mm-hmm. Like you would have one where you would be walking down the stairs, all of a sudden a thought would come in, what if I fell down these stairs?
Yeah, a thought might pop into my head that would say, well, what if you just fell down the stairs right now?
Yeah, or I would like be on the freeway and then some thought would come into my head, well, what if I just veered into this person and I would just get into, and kill myself? These were just random thoughts. And then we also found Carlos Castaneda's version of this, which he called in the Don Juan books flyers. And
right, these are like these autonomous field entities that would come into your experience and trigger you into destructive thinking.
Yeah, and then we had an experience once where we live, there was a very destructive man who lived next door, was in a wheelchair and couldn't function anymore, and he actually died one night while we were having a very serious conversation and kind of in a very sensitive kind of a realm. And at one point, we didn't know that he was dying next door, but all of a sudden I felt like I was dying and this thing was trying to get in me.
Yeah, it was bizarre. It was like this. We were at the time, we were very much delving into our own darkness at the time, and this is several years ago. And this would trigger a lot of old grief and a lot of anger and deep destructive emotions. and we were engaged in some kind of a conversation that was taking us, or probably taking Melissa, back into some of this material. And while this was going on, this gentleman next door we found out later, that was right at the moment when he was dying, actually. And we could go into his whole history and stuff, but he was absolutely plagued by destructive programs, you could call them, entities,
he had
cycles.
severe trauma too.
It's severe trauma and a very just a really traumatic upbringing. But at the moment that he was dying, Melissa sort of spontaneously moved into this mood swing where, instead of just being you know, in a sensitive place, and we had been before, she actually moved into a place where she believed that she was dying, and that she went into this very deep, scary place.
I felt like there was something that was trying to get into me. That there was actually something that was trying to get into me, and this was really before we had really come to any theories about the virus, or we even were calling it the virus. This was prior to that. Mm-hmm. So we found that it was a very strong experience.
And the point of that being that you could speculate that perhaps when someone dies, that whatever these energetic programs of the psyche are, all the many programs of the psyche, and I have to model this for you in a moment here so we can understand this better. But something basically was energetically reaching out and looking for a place to survive, essentially, is what it was like. And when you go into the prior understandings of demons and evil spirits and stuff, people usually throw those off and say, well, those are just naive fantasies. But I think that they are more primitive understandings of an energetic reality. And this experience started to move us into even deeper waters here, and I've always been reluctant to want to take on some kind of a mythological understanding. I've always wanted to have a more scientific understanding of these things, and they're invisible. The domains of the psyche, of the mind, so-called the mind, and so I've always wanted to try to found our understandings in as rigorous of models as possible, and going into demonic possession and stuff like that kind of never really worked for me. But I had these experiences, and we're talking about a couple out of many experiences that sort of had to bring me into a more accepting or more holistic understanding of this. But if you don't mind, I could just now explain that if you could imagine I don't know if we mentioned in the last talk, but there's a very fine thinker named John C. Lilly, and he did a lot of amazing work in the 60s with psychedelics, but also a combination of using psychedelics in isolation tanks, and he introduced a lot of novel concepts that I think are still not really understood. But one of those was the understanding of the human being as a biological computer, as a biocomputer. And so if you could imagine your mind or your psyche, and these two terms are they at least in our vocabulary, they mean the same thing. And if you could understand if you could see your body sort of like with a computer, for example, a computer has a physical aspect, the physical computer itself with all the chips and the peripherals and all of the components that make up a computer. And that's a physical side. And then there is an energetic informational side of the computer that is its operating system, its software, all of the scripts and codes that go into the making up what the computer's own internal informational domain. These are the sort of two sides of a computer, and it's the same. If you could look at the human being in the same way, where you look at the body as the mechanical side of the equation, and you look at the mind as the operating system, as the software side, as the information side of the equation, then I think then you have some kind of a model that you can use for understanding the psyche, for understanding any kinds of destructive entities in the psyche. And if you expand that out to see how computers are networked in a network, and we call it the internet now, and so that the internet is sort of the shared informational domain where all of the software that all these individual computers are interrelating to each other. It's an entire ecosystem of information scripts. Well, human culture can be seen in the same way. And so you have the individual mind or psyche is sort of the microcosm, and then you have the culture as the macrocosm. And they're self-similar, they're totally related, and whatever is in the culture is also in the individual minds, and whatever is in people's individual minds is also in the culture, just like computers and the internet. They're all totally linked and interrelated. And this is energy being passed as information packets. Well, the same thing is going on in the human psyche, in the human mind, and you could look at it that way. I would add that the human mind or psyche is not a linear mechanical operation like a computer is, but it is an organic, living, biological operation. Not only are the components of the body living entities, all of your cells, for example, but all of the informational components of the mind, I believe, are also living. These are living, informational, energetic components of the human being. And if you could sort of use what I've just said here as a model for understanding what the human mind is, now you can start to see how that in the realm of information systems, in the realm of computers, there exists parasites, viruses, malicious scripts, Trojan horses, just as there are beneficial programs, beneficial applications which assist you, there are parasitic applications which attach to your computer, to your operating system, and then use your operating system for their own purposes. They are autonomous agents which infect your computer. Same thing is going on in biology. If you look down into the domain of your cellular structure, you are filled with all kinds of parasites. They're called viruses, and there's many other kinds of bacterial parasites and many other kinds of parasites all up in your body, all throughout the biosphere, all through every ecosystem. In fact, parasitic relationships are the most prominent or abundant types of relationships between living entities in the biosphere. And so if you are speculating as to whether or not there could be aspects of your own mind, of your own psyche, that are operating parasitically or virally, and you look in these other domains of biological life, in the microscopic domain of biological life, or in the domain of computer information systems, you see parasites and viruses everywhere. Would you not see that in the psyche? Is that not possible? Is that not probable? And once you can see the psyche as an organic operating system, or as a biological or sort of informational, energetic ecosystem of interrelated programs or entities, then you can see how some of these programs or entities in the human mind could be parasitic, they could be viral. And then once you've opened that possibility and said, okay, that could be, there could be aspects of my mind, of my psyche, that are viral in nature. And yeah, okay, all human minds are interrelated through this domain that we call the culture. They could be communicable, they could be transmittable, they could be genetically and otherwise transmittable. That's a possibility. Now let's go look and see if there is evidence for that. Let's go study our own. Let's go study the destructive cycles that are going on in our own relationships, in our own minds and bodies, in our own culture, and see if they fit to that model. And if you go look for that, I believe that you will see that these destructive cycles that we all experience do stick to that model. They do fall within that model. And then you can start to try to get to, well, what is the source of them? How are they formed? What can we do to mitigate these forces? Things like that. But I think hopefully I've given you a description that helps you to understand how the mind or the psyche and the culture are these energetic domains that can and do harbor these parasitic entities, operations, however you want to put it, and that they are everywhere. And then I would say that a big part of what psychologists call the shadow, or the Jungians especially describe as the shadow, a big part of that, I believe, is the parasitic life cycle of these psychic operations.
Wow, his Gettysburg Address.
See, it's such a big domain, though. It's so complex, and it has to be laid out. I mean, I hope that I was able to lay it out in a way that wasn't confusing there.
Okay, well, we're going to walk through some aspects of our current culture and civilization. Just before we do that, a couple of thoughts very briefly that occurred to me. John Lilly, I think the film Altered States is based on his work.
It's true.
So I wanted to throw that out there for folks because they might be interested in watching that. It's not a documentary, actually, it's a drama.
Yeah, it's fictionalized, but yes.
Yeah, quite disturbing. Also, with regard to Eckhart Tolle, I recently gave a friend a gift of his book, A New Earth. And I kind of observed that most of the millions of people who bought his books, it's now packaged the colors are always a bit pastel-y, but it's very much in the new age, Hay House type of improve your life type thing. And the aspects you were talking about that were kind of overlooked, possibly by some people deliberately, I think that's very important because he's a very prominent author now. And I think that a lot of people, if they're writing about him or communicating his ideas to other people, do not talk about this dark aspect that he talks about.
Right.
And I think that a lot of people who maybe pick up his books are looking for yet another how-to guide, a positive thinking, happy clappy, and they may get something from that, but they're missing something. I don't think a lot of people who read it are going to want that to use the phrase I did in our first interview. They're not going to want to stare into that abyss. So I think there's an aspect of Tolle's work there that's been overlooked. And your story about the wheelchair-bound guy reminded me of a story that Tolle himself relates in one of his books.
Yes.
And I don't know, you obviously know where I'm going with it.
It's in the second book where he's talking about the pain body and how it's how it resonates with other people's pain bodies and how it can invoke these situations in the public. Yes.
This is Tolle going into the restaurant.
Yes.
And Eckhart Tolle and friend go into an Indian restaurant. I can't remember whether it's they've only looked at the menu or whether they've ordered their food, whether they've started their meal. But at one of the other tables, there's a guy. I'm not sure if the fact that he's in a wheelchair, I suspect, has some relevance to what happens.
Yeah.
But he becomes somewhat agitated, and then this builds and builds to the point where the guy is incredibly agitated. People will have to check out the exact details because I'm paraphrasing here, but he ends up remonstrating with the staff. He tells them the food is rubbish. Everything about the experience has been terrible. He just storms out of the restaurant as much as you can storm anywhere in a wheelchair, bumping into staff, just behaving absolutely outrageously, as if something terrible had happened to him.
And then he comes back. He storms back into the place later on, too. He's in a rage.
Yeah, he is. And he says to Tolle, "Did you do this?"
Oh, the waiter says to Tolle, who is frequently visits that restaurant, "Do you have something to do with this?"
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
But before that happened, he had just had a session with this woman, and there had been something very deep and disturbing going on in that session. And in fact, I think he says in the book that when his friend came to pick him up to take him to dinner, he or she noticed that there was a very negative vibration in the air in the room at his office. and then he went to the restaurant, and that situation happened, and then so the idea is could he have dragged this virus? Could he have dragged this entity with him to the restaurant? And I would say that what is just, inside your body, there are all kinds of viruses which are shared throughout the culture, but which your body has an immunity to, and so you can't actually get taken over by them. But they're in there doing what they can do. They generally can't get away with anything, but we all do carry all these kinds of pathogens in us. And so could it be that Tolle was basically acting as a carrier for a program that was running in his patient, and that he was then himself energized in a resonant way, and then he brought that to the restaurant, and then that was what resonated with somebody else that was there. It's not that it's not like this this dark cloud was just dragged with Tolle to the restaurant, but Tolle is actually carrying the resonance of this destructive script with him, because it's in him too. It's in all of us. We all have these potential destructive scripts. It's just a matter of, like Tolle, for example, he's not going to get caught up in it. He's basically immune to it at his level of development, but it doesn't mean that he can't carry it with him out into the public, where then another person who has that same virus and is basically triggered by that energy. Now, that individual that had that fit of rage in the restaurant, he has that fit of rage in a lot of restaurants. He does that in his life all over the place. But so it was only that perhaps something that Tolle brought was able to trigger that in him. And perhaps it is even non-local. Perhaps it doesn't have anything to do with Tolle physically bringing energy with him to the restaurant. Perhaps there is an even much deeper non-local sort of quantum relationship between these events that maybe we really don't even want to have to speculate about here, because then we'll have to really get into some really and we won't be able to prove anything. So.
Well, I mean, just again, briefly to round that off, one thought is the idea non-locality kind of makes sense, not necessarily in a quantum physics context, but the idea of everything being within mind, our brains being a conduit, you mentioned the biocomputer idea. Well, then it would make sense that Tolle isn't, physically dragging anything, or even, metaphysically dragging anything, but it is non-local in that sense. And it's just a question of where it surfaces, if you see what I mean.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's good, Greg. Exactly. It's non-local, and it's only a question of where it surfaces. That's good. Yeah, right.
So we were going to walk through a little bit about our culture and civilization as it currently is, and there was a bunch of areas here, and we could talk about each one of them probably for an hour, but I think it's worth mentioning because this is the stuff that shapes our lives to a greater or lesser extent. However aware or unaware we are of it, it's still operating. You see what I mean? The program is running. It's just whether we're tuned into it or not. Overall, our civilization, certainly it fits the parasitic model. And the word necrotrophic, I don't know, that was in your book. I don't know if that's your word or whether that came from somewhere else.
No, it's a biological term, scientific word.
Well, yeah, that's perfect. But the headline one for me is politics and economics. I'm putting them together because I see them really as two sides of the same coin in a way, because they're so tied together. And there you have, writ large dysfunction and this destructive force. And we characterized the destructive force in the first interview as ultimately a creative challenger. Yeah. But we're talking about, in this instance, we're talking about something macro version of what you've been talking about at the personal level.
Parasitic, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, you only have to look at that system for, I mean, everyone will have sort of, oh my God, politics, turn off the TV, you know, it's all corrupt, blah, blah, blah. Economics, like, oh, what do I know about that? It's like, you know, it's a mess. All we know is it's not working, but we don't know how it's not working. And I think those are two of the most dominant forces in our lives. And it's really strange because so many people will kind of say, yes, this is wrecking everything in this, whatever you take that phrase to mean. But yet in all, we feel that it's somehow immutable and eternal and inevitable.
Yeah, well, politics and economics is these are domains of human connectedness that we are going to have for a long, long time. I mean, they are fundamental to the operation of culture, but it is only the modality of these domains that really we're probably more concerned with here. It's not that politics itself is necessarily fundamentally destructive, or that economics is fundamentally destructive. It's the profile of these operations that can be parasitic or destructive. There's if you look into economics and you look into different alternative economic models that are available that we could be using, there are plenty of them that are more on the symbiotic side. But if you look at the nature of the current economic system, the dominant economic system that we have, it's the fractional reserve, Federal Reserve banking type of a model. It operates like a biological or informational parasite does. And the same thing with the politics is that it is very much dependent on trickery. It is dependent on subterfuge. It is dependent on the political system or the economic system holds out a carrot and it says, here, don't you want this? Don't you want this? And then you grab the thing and you find out that it's infected. And then once it gets inside of you, it starts to suck your human energy. Whether this is a loan that you get from a bank, and then once you take the loan, then there's the interest, and then you don't make the payment in time, and then the interest goes up, and then you have a problem, and you go to the bank, and they say, well, let's give you a bigger loan then, and then you're stuck with more interest. And then if you follow that and trace that around the whole economy, how that all money is created through loans, it's all debt money. This is a parasitic system. And the guys at the top are allowed to push the debt off onto the rest of the culture, and then they load it off on all of us. And with the politics, it's basically about trickery. It's about saying, hey, we're going to take care of you if you put us into power, and then as soon as you put them into power, then they take care of themselves and their friends, and they actually parasite off of you, and they use your energy for their own private needs. That's not the way it has to be run, but that's the way it is run, because just like in biology, just like in your computer, if you have no awareness of how these viral operations work, if you don't know what a parasitic life cycle is, if you don't know that this entire environment of economics and politics is littered with parasites everywhere, or parasitic modes of operation, if you don't know that, you're totally naive and you're going to get hurt. So it's the same thing with in all these domains.
I would just bring up that the media is also very parasitic and actually plays upon the politics and the economics, and feeds actual chemicals into humans who follow mainstream media of fear and greed and these destructive feelings, which actually cause rage, anger, which causes a chemical response and a like resonance to places in the audience's own psyche. and which is actually another way of feeding off of humanity.
Totally. The term media means a medium, just like if you're looking at a culture, like a yeast culture in a petri dish, there is a substrate, there is a media or a medium that this biological culture is living off of. And if you consider that there are human beings who act parasitically, and they're usually at the sort of the top of the dominance hierarchy of our culture, and that they then attach themselves to the rest of the population through this substrate that we call the media. And so she was talking about these different vibrations that are passed through the media, these news stories that are there to invoke fear, and that are there to invoke all of these different destructive emotions in yourself. These what they basically do is it charges you, it turns you on to these different vibrations, and now you are resonating at a vibration that vibrates with the vibration of these parasitic systems.
And they
you are addicted
using
to them then.
They are using trickery, just like a biological virus.
Just like a biological parasite or virus uses trickery. You could
talk about the cat virus just as an example, but they do use trickery to get this chemical response so that you will be a slave to their cultural parasitism.
Oh, absolutely. Or well, we could let Greg guide us into some other domains, but before we get too far, what a lot of people in recent times have noticed is, there is a whole alternative scene of people that have noticed that, hey, they haven't maybe said that it's parasitic, but there is a destructive shadow government or New World Order or group of individuals who are preying upon the human population, and they go back through bloodlines, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's true, and I think you can definitely trace that and see that. But when you start to say, oh, it is the Queen of England who is the evil one, it is Prince Philip who is the evil one, it is George Bush or Dick Cheney or Mayor Rothschild or one of these other individuals, these are the parasites. And you start saying, well, look, they're reptilians and they are parasites feeding on humanity, then I think that you've stopped a little bit short, because you have to go now into this shared collective informational energetic domain of the mind and the culture. The mind and the culture are totally interrelated. They are operating systems. And you have to go into this domain to get to the next level, to see where are these parasitic programs coming from. These individuals that you might point to and say, you're an evil one, you're taking advantage of the human being, they are themselves taken over by these destructive mental scripts. They are themselves victims. They are hosts. It's like somebody that has a rabies virus. Do you in the past, before you knew about a virus, before you knew about microscopic parasites, you might look to that individual and say, there's some, you are evil. You are passing this evil to the community. In prior understandings, they actually knew that it was some kind of a demon, or they thought it was a possession of some kind. And so they always knew that it wasn't the human being, it was some kind of another entity that had attached itself to the human being that was infecting the rest of the community. Well, that's true. These individuals are people who are harboring, in Jungian terms, these are people who have an autonomous shadow complex, a shadow archetype that is running in them that's destructive. And you could see that in terms of this parasitic model that we're talking about. These individuals are just biological people like anyone else, but they are running very strongly a destructive shadow script, a parasitic script, and that's what's being passed on. And these individuals, these hierarchs, they get together and they are of like resonance. They're sharing these shadow programs, and then that makes them more powerful. And then you have situations like we have now where we're just looking at this thing of this documentary called Vaxxed, which is now being banned and blah blah blah. It's about the possibility that the American government or one of these agencies, the CDC, has withheld and repressed information showing that this major vaccine that all children get causes autism. And you have a situation where you have individuals in the CDC who are actively holding back this information and purposefully allowing this totally reckless and destructive situation. And you have to ask yourself, are these like little Hitlers that are just sitting on the board, that are just these 3 or 4 nasty little guys that just love doing this? Or is this something much more subtle than that? This is something that where, when you really look into it, the people that you really think are the most evil people are themselves acting unconsciously, and that there is something inside of them that has them.
It's an autonomous, it becomes actually autonomous. Their field has been taken over by these scripts.
Well, there's something very important here, and this reminds me actually again of Paul Levy's book, The Madness of George W. Bush. The idea being that George W. Bush, as if that subhuman IQ poor wretch was going to be sort of doing anything on a global scale. And the bigger point here that I think is very important in terms of people approaching this or trying to come to an understanding of this and how to deal with it is that, you mentioned the New World Order, and you mentioned individuals, Dick Cheney and all these other demons, like Brzezinski and Kissinger and everything else. These organizations, individuals, cabals, all this stuff that you read about on conspiracy websites, most of this is a heat sink. I see it as like a lightning rod, and it serves whatever else it's doing. It channels people's well-meaning people's energy away from the bigger picture that you're talking about. And I think when people can become obsessed with conspiracy theories and worrying about Illuminati bloodlines and all this historical stuff, and it is what it is, and some of it's verifiable, some of it's not. And you mentioned like royal bloodlines as well. A lot of people get completely lost down that rabbit hole. And I mean, I've been around David Icke for a while, and I've got to look at him at work firsthand, and he's doing what he's doing, and he's raising some, many valid points in areas that are worth exploring. And I see a lot of the people, and I'm not singling him out here, by the way. I use him from time to time as a well-known example of this phenomenon. And I've seen a lot of people, again, good, well-meaning people who have been, their imagination has been caught by what he's saying, some of the things, who then proceed to get completely lost in the world of black helicopters and tinfoil hats, and everything becomes a conspiracy, and it's completely debilitating. It actually, for most people, it serves for them to be no action whatsoever. It becomes about who's doing what, how can you read between the lines, rather than your own inner work, your understanding of how we work, what is working on us. Different levels of this that allow you to be able to deal with it, within yourself and then within other people. And it's just, it robs people of a wider understanding, I think. So, obsession with conspiracy theories, you're almost better off being willfully blind, the sort of person who just wants, a cheeseburger and a 6-pack and to watch the game. They're doing, how can I put it? They're almost as much plugged into the matrix as somebody who's, going on and on about the House of Habsburg or the Rothschilds constantly or whatever, and with their nose stuck in a book or probably now in a website. You see what I mean? It's both in one form or another in action.
I would agree with that completely, and I would just add that there's different phases of waking up your consciousness, and I think getting into the whole shadow that a lot of people will come into it through the shadow of our culture. And it's a very important point of waking up. The problem which you brought up, I think, is they get sucked into it and are looking at this totally externally instead of seeing those same codes in their own psyche.
That's right.
And that's what we've done. We were at that point. I was looking at, because of having cancer and all that, and looking at the destructive nature and the parasitic nature of the medical system and all that. And that was an important part of my own growth. And Colin got very much into looking at the shadow government and the shadow culture. But what we've done is we realized that we were harboring the same energy in ourselves that's in the culture. Mm-hmm. And that's where we went. So I think that what you said is absolutely spot on.
Yeah, it's like a stopping point. It's going into the shadow of your culture is one stop down the rabbit hole. And if you can get down to that level of studying the Illuminati and especially like false flag terrorism, I mean, false flag terrorism is one of those areas that I think when you're going to go in to start looking at the shadow of your culture, I think you might as well learn about that, because that's very, very important, and it very much charges the society and moves the society into a destructive place. And if you don't know that a lot of terrorist events are inside jobs, they're basically exactly like how a parasite works. And maybe later I can describe this one Toxoplasma gondii, this one parasite, so people can really see how parasites work. But it's like, that's good information. It's important to see that this stuff is going on underneath the culture. But if you stop there and then you just keep on just looking at that domain, you're stopping short of the next level. And the next level is to understand that all of these destructive operations in the culture, all of these shadow programs that have been passed along generation after generation after generation, these are also microcosmically represented inside of your own mind, inside of your own psyche. And that and Jung, he did a lot of great work in this direction, and he noticed that every one of these totalitarian regimes or any of these mass destructive cycles, if you just look at the external correlate to this, then you would just keep getting lost thinking that, well, somehow just evil Hitlers keep just being born, unfortunately, accidentally, and then we keep having to be subject to these terrible cycles because of these evil Stalins or Hitlers or George Bushes that keep being born, these Brzezinskis or whoever you want to point to. But what he said was that these are people who are representing a psychic energy that is inside of every human being, and that to the degree that the human being is unaware of that destructive aspect of their own mind, they will then project it out onto somebody else who will act as the carrier, as the transmitter of this on behalf of them. All of the Germans, all of the people around the world, or the whole West, you could see the whole West as an interrelated culture, and everybody was part of that destructive cycle that we point to when we look at World War II and of the totalitarian governments that came out of it. Everybody was a part of that. The Germans very powerfully, but everybody was playing into that cycle. They were somewhere in the greater script of that story that was playing out.
At the time, and ever since, actually, was like, how did an entire nation lose its mind, with reference to Germany under the Nazi regime? Mm-hmm. And you can begin to see answers, pointers in the right direction to these sorts of questions in this context.
Yeah, the Germans could not see this destructive control freak shadow it's the father. Okay, so Hitler represents the destructive father archetype. We call it the father thing, and it is sort of the control freak, tyrant shadow of the beneficent father, and this was a shadow that was gaining in energy. You could go back to World War I, and you can look at all of the losses that the Germans suffered, and all of the grief and all of the wounds to their ego. And you can just point to World War I if you want to, but you have to go back further and further. But basically, this was an aspect of this society's collective psyche that was being denied, that was being repressed, that was something that they fundamentally would not or could not look at about themselves. And so it basically found its way out. And you talk to people now who are now, most of them are dying, who are around during those times. And this was a collective psychosis. That was a collective magnetic, unconscious mass psychosis that grabbed millions of people and caused them to act unconsciously in the same way, in that if you are triggered or accosted in your own life in such a way that just gets you so mad that you can get taken over to the point to where you say, I'm seeing red. Somebody.
Oh, we can see it right now in this whole elections, parasitic, totally destructive elections cycle that's going on in the United States right now. Yeah. Both sides are feeding directly into this. They have totally been taken over, all sides. And they are being parasitically fed upon by the media and the culture. Yes. And they're all like totally, it is psychotic. It has taken over people.
Yeah. Jung said that one of he pointed to the extreme collectivization of the German people and how that they were able to collectively align themselves politically, ideologically. In America, this is much harder. This is why America, to my mind, why America has not yet fallen to a totalitarian regime, or why that's not happening right now, is because America cannot be united collectively into a single ideal. If America could be united collectively into a single ideal, and that's one of the things that the neocons were trying to do around September 11th, was to unite the American people into this single ideal, then that becomes that becomes a transmission medium for these destructive psychic scripts to pass. But because there are so many different communities, so many different value systems, this is such a varied cultural, racial ecosystem in the United States. I don't think that kind of a singular totalitarian kind of tyranny can rise up. That energy does want to flow, and it finds these little places to flow, but it can't totally take over the whole country. But you can watch it, like she was saying, in these political cycles. You see the people who are supposed to be the Bernie Sanders fans, what do you call them? Voters, fans, they're supposed to be, into equality and egalitarianism and sharing and fairness and all of these high principles. They're supposed to be into that, but yet you watch them on the ground. Like I remember making one comment to a Bernie Sanders activist somewhere online or something, just kind of exposing a small comment, really kind of exposing the fraud of the whole thing. He got so mad with me, went to my Facebook page, started looking at me personally, and then started to hammer me with personal attacks about I was just a piece of crap, and I was just this, and I was just that, and just attacked me. And I was like, okay, well...
And you're seeing that in the news
you see that at these rallies.
Anti-Trump rallies.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that the other side is not. They're just as taken over. It's both sides.
It's both sides. So they both manifest these destructive shadow energies. They say that their politician is going to be the one to put a damper on these energies, while they themselves are living out these destructive energies in their lives. And so this is what you saw in Nazi Germany. This is what you saw with any of the governments of Russia and China. And there was a whole wave of totalitarian tyrannies that have occurred in the 20th century. And these are all a function of the denied, repressed, destructive energy of the shadow, which we are now kind of describing in terms of parasitic life cycles.
Okay, guys, well, a lot of people will be thinking, well, what on earth do we do about this? People who see it as clearly as we've been describing may feel a sense of powerlessness, a bit like the conspiracy theorists I mentioned. It's okay, well, now what? And a lot of people will experience cognitive dissonance, a conscious or subconscious denial as a protective mechanism. Yeah. And a lot of people believe that they are very objective and rational, but actually people, even academics and scientists, and maybe mostly them, are as subjective and emotional as everyone else. And I think that if they deny that aspect of their psyche, then that puts them at a disadvantage as well. Yeah. There's the thought that confronting this, and this is something that you guys certainly mentioned in terms of your own lives, confronting this to be healed, or at least to process it. And we see a lot of this, I think, in a superficial way in the burgeoning, sort of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis that's been going on for decades. People trying to grapple with some of these things, but coming away from a surgery with a big dossier about their lives, which they then put in a filing cabinet somewhere, and that doesn't really move them any closer to resolution. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned, we've talked about Eckhart Tolle, and in facing some of these things, he's a good embodiment, I think, of transformation through suffering, mm-hmm. because, he had this trauma in his life that basically pushed him through to the other side, if I can put it like that. Yeah. I'm reminded of in The Empire Strikes Back, where Luke Skywalker goes into the cave at Yoda says, your destiny lies in there. And he goes into battle Darth Vader and then discovers that it's himself. It's his own darkness that he's confronting. So, and also the idea of transformation through suffering is not the only way to do it. I think we may have mentioned, or in the first interview, that some people are kind of born with a sense that something is going on, if you see what I mean, in the context of what we've been talking about. But maybe it's for them, it's baby steps towards a higher realization. But however you do it, people will want some thoughts on what they can do. And I would suggest that on one level, you can help no one else. Start with yourself. That's just my personal feeling. Yeah. A bit like, I'm sure we said this in the first interview, if your aircraft is going down, put on your own oxygen mask before helping. That's perfect. Helping your kids. So whether it's techniques, practices, emotional clearing, just a general awareness, it's like give people some thoughts on where they could maybe explore in their own lives. Yeah.
So it was through understanding these concepts and then us starting to watch our thoughts and watching our emotional states that we came into some information and a process that helped us immensely. The first thing I would mention, so it's John Ruskin, and his book is called Emotional Clearing. And there's another guy,
Michael Brown, the
Michael
presence
Brown,
process.
the presence process. And those are two resources that are basically teaching you the same process. And what it is, well, number one, and we talked about this in the first interview, it's not natural to want to go into these dark, uncomfortable areas of the psyche and your emotional system. It's actually probably more difficult or challenging than even physical pain. I found, at least in my own experience, that going into this blocked, repressed emotional material is very challenging. The first thing that you do have to do before you start any kind of work like this is have your basic physical health being taken care of. You want to make sure that you're eating well, just a basic, healthy, real food diet. You don't want to be eating all the processed foods. You want your body to be somewhat strong to be able to start, going into your own psyche. And then basic meditation or mindfulness practices are very important also. Just starting to watch your thoughts and watch your emotional states.
Develop a sense of awareness of your own thought processes, your own emotional processes that are going on, to the point to where they don't just take you over anymore without you, the higher aspect, the higher I, seeing them. It doesn't mean that you can, it takes a long time to get control over your mental, emotional processes. But if you can get to the point to where you can see them happening as they are happening or before they occur, and you can watch your own states, or at least if you get into very disruptive states, if you can wake up to them while they're occurring, and just start to put more attention on watching the internal domain of your mind, then that general practice in life is a tool that you're going to need to be able to get deeper into psychic healing, into personal evolution, however you want to call it.
Right. So this basic process is to when you...
So she's now describing the process,
the actual emotional
of emotional clearing that John Ruskin describes in his book.
So
which is a very powerful method for releasing destructive or repressed emotional energy, which is basically a food source for these destructive cycles in your life.
Yes. This parasitic energy actually feeds on these fractures that are created from trauma in your own life, or they can even be passed on in a family virus. And we can give some examples of that. But the actual process itself is when you feel charged, if you can get it, when you actually feel charged in a charged situation, it can be as simple as being in a fight or with your spouse, or getting cut off on the freeway, or something at work really charges you. In that moment or soon after it, if you can find a space to be by yourself, and instead of trying to repress that emotion, that charge that you feel,
or distract from it,
try to do something else,
get on the internet or
whatever you do to distract yourself from that situation, you actually just stop and you sit in that charge, in that emotional state, and you allow it to just be what it is. And the energy will actually move. It will actually move itself.
Right.
Now, at first, it can be a little challenging, depending on how charged you are in that particular instance. and it can bring up anger, fear, grief. But the idea is to allow yourself to go through that whole emotional cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And you would not, like, if a child falls down and you're taking care of a child, you don't just say stop,
Stop crying.
Stop crying. That's obviously bad parenting, and some of us did have that. But
it's not obviously bad parenting. When a child falls down and goes, or a child runs into their own emotional system.
Right.
When something happens in life to a small child, to where they start to cry, to where they start to feel in some way charged, what we often do in this society is we try to stop that child from going through the full cycle. And so we either try to have a lollipop so you won't feel this way, or tell them, no, don't do this, or not now, or this, that, or the other. So we're often blocked from going through the full emotional cycle that we experience as small children. And we experience these cycles often all throughout the day. And what that does is that blocks our physiological channels. And so from the very beginning of our lives, in this society especially, we have all kinds of blocked up emotions because we were not allowed to experience the full cycle. The better thing to do with children is to allow the child to experience the full cycle, but be there to support them, to nurture them while they're having the experience, while they're crying, while they're feeling this sense of lack or of need or whatever, and just be there. Even if the child wants something that you just cannot give the child more candy right now or whatever, and the child starts crying over the whole thing, the better thing to do is, I know that you can't have any candy. I know that it doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel fair, but just be there with the child and allow the child to have that full emotional process. They will then cycle through the full, complete cycle, and that energy will find its proper channels. But what happens is this starts from early childhood. We block that, and then we are trained through the way that our society is structured to block that again. You're not allowed to cry at work. You're not even allowed, men, for example, in our society, are not even allowed to cry at all, really. And so we can go on and on about all of the different feelings that we're not allowed to experience, or that we're only allowed to experience in certain contexts. And so we're all emotionally blocked up, tied up, and we're full of all of this energy. And so what Melissa is saying is, when you do this process, when you are triggered, when there is something going on in your life that makes you feel very angry, makes you feel fearful, it makes you feel sad, rather than distracting away from it or listening to the programming that's in your head that says you shouldn't feel this way at this time, this isn't adult, or this isn't proper, or this isn't this, that, and the other, you take the opportunity to go sit with it, and you allow it to completely take you over, and you allow that emotion to fully express itself as though you are a child.
Right. Well, it's basically you're being your own parent. If
Right.
you're able to, and this is the other key to this, is that's why the mindfulness practices are very important, because there's a part of every human being that when it's turned on, you can actually kind of be above your psyche. You can actually be the
watch it.
You can watch it. John Ruskin does call it the watcher.
Right.
And you are able not to get totally sucked in. You could still have that full emotional experience and allow that energy to flow through your body, but you're not taken over by it, and you're able to watch it. It's like being your own parent.
It's true.
You're supporting your own self.
Right. So you might be there sitting there with a whole bunch of rage, just wanting to vibrate you to death, or you might be sitting there with a pit in your stomach of intense grief that was triggered through some experience, or you might just start crying deeply for, it could be up to hours. You could even find yourself triggered into crying that deeply for that long. And there is a part of you that is just watching you, saying, here I am, this is what's going through me. if I'm doing this, it must be because there's a need for it, and you allow that energy to flow through you. And if you're with somebody else and you're supporting somebody else, then you'll just allow them to go through the process. Now, if you start taking more opportunities to allow these triggers that happen in your life that make you feel very emotionally energized in a destructive way, if you allow them to become doorways into this, into these pools of destructive energy in you, and allow them to flow through you fully, and you start doing this for a year or two, whenever you can. It's not always possible when you're in your life to just, well, I got to duck out and go cry out over on this bench over here for an hour. You can't always do that, but as soon as you can get in touch with that feeling again, maybe that night, you can go into this and you can process this emotion. You will start to open up the blocked physiological channels, and you will start to allow this energy to find its natural place again, and you will reduce the amount of the repressed energy and therefore reduce your ability or reduce the potential for you to be triggered in life. And what is going on is that we're talked about all of this destructive cultural parasitism that's going on. The food source for all of this destructive Illuminati stuff, or child abuse and rape and government abuse and all of this different destructive stuff that's going on in the culture, the food source for all of this behavior is all of these emotions and psychic energy that lives within all of us, that cannot find a natural or a healthy channel for itself, and it is repressed, and it is being fed upon by a destructive cyclical program of your psyche, of the culture, which you're basically your ecosystem of your mind is now infected with all kinds of scripts which are using your repressed energy that you have not found a proper channel for. And so that's what this process does, is it gets this energy out in the open, it gets it out of you in a peaceful, healthy way. And then you are basically not a hospitable host anymore for these parasitic operations.
Yeah, as you will find, and this has really, really happened to us, is that you don't get charged as much, but even more than that, your channels, your consciousness itself starts to evolve.
Totally.
Dramatically.
It's true.
Your psychic, your deep psychic abilities, your higher circuits, so to speak.
Your access to your heart, to your compassion.
Your heart. That's the other thing, is you get a much greater compassion and acceptance of all life and of all of the universe. And your heart chakra turns on. And one term that we always use is the heart is toxic to the virus. Mm-hmm. When your heart energy is turned on, and people who fall in love feel this, immediately, as their heart is turned on and everything is just daisies and, and Bruce Lipton actually has a whole book about it, which is actually really good. It's called The Honeymoon Effect. And the whole point is that if you're accessing your heart energy and you've actually cleared this repressed energy, these fractures, and that energy starts to move, then you become resistant to these viral attacks.
Yeah, you become resistant. They shrink down in your own life. You don't, until you start to let go of some of this repressed energy, you don't even realize how much how closed down you are. And if you look at, if you just look at the difference between highly civilized Westerners, Germans, English, Americans, Swiss, Swedes, all of us, from this civilization, and you compare the way we raise children, the way all of our concerns in life and all of that to indigenous people, to aboriginals, to indigenous people, and you see a massive difference there in that these more ancient people are so much more open to life. They're so much more in acceptance of the way things are. They are so much less interested in controlling the future, in controlling their children, and they are just much more in the heart, unless, of course, they've been traumatized by specific situations or by colonization. But they're so much more open. They don't have their hearts blocked, whereas the Westerners are so concerned with the career and where they're going and how their children have to be and how they should look to other people, and we're all stuffed up. And the advantage to the way that we are as Westerners with this very ordering mind is that we're able to create technology like we're using to communicate around the world. And there's an amazing advantage to this sort of control freak mindset that we have in this culture. But the downside of it is that it closes off all of our physiological channels to move all of our ancient archetypal energies. And then they become repressed, and then they become the psychic food source for all of this destruction to occur. And what we're talking about here with mindfulness and then emotional clearing like this is we're talking about alchemical work. We're talking about, in Jungian terms, this is individuation work, and this is spiritual alchemy. This is going into the negrito. This is going into your own darkness and transmuting that destructive energy into a higher form of energy.
It does refine your consciousness.
Absolutely.
It is absolute alchemy, and we only came into that later after we started doing this work, and we figured out for ourselves that what we were doing was alchemy.
And if you look into the model of alchemy and at the different stages, and you try to understand it in spiritual developmental terms, it's absolutely true that the reason why the alchemical methodology is set up in the order in which it is because it's absolutely necessary. If you're interested in enlightenment or raising your vibration, raising your consciousness, people talk about the consciousness of humanity has to be raised. Well, what that means is your consciousness has to be raised, because you are one cell in this greater organism. And if you have cancer, you're going to pass it on to the greater organism. So you need to raise your consciousness. There's only one individual that has to do anything in this world, and that's you. And so alchemy is about going into your own crud, your own darkness, your own wounds, all of the old fractured aspects of your psyche in whatever way they are manifest.
The negrito aspect of alchemy.
Yeah, the first stage of alchemy is about going into all of that stuff, because those are the discordances, the fractures that are keeping the greater, higher purpose of your soul, so to speak, from being able to manifest its highest purpose in this lifetime. It's those fractures and those parasitic scripts which are living off of those fractures, which are holding you back, and you have to go into them. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is we were trying to develop a clear methodology, a clear understanding, and a clear modeling for what it is that we're doing when we're going into our own darkness. We're trying to go into this cave. We're trying to go into the woods with some kind of maps for understanding what is it that we're getting into. We're not just jumping into a pit. And we're good. We're not just jumping into a pit and going, "Oh, I hope I survive this I hope I survive this situation." No, we're saying, okay, well, we don't know everything that's inside of this cave, but we have the tools, we have some general maps, we have some general understandings about where we come from, what the problems in our past are, what our particular demons are, so we know how to, to keep an eye out for them. And then we're going to go one by one into each of these wounds, into each of these particular fractures, and we're just going to take it from there. And you're not really going into a dragon's lair where a dragon is just going to just reach out and grab you and breathe fire on you and burn you to a singe in an instant. It's not like that. You're going to take smaller steps. And just like doing anything in life, any career that you're building, any art that you're creating, anything that you're creating in your life, which is evolutionary, is done one small step at a time, and you run into little problems, and you cure those problems, and you run into the next one, and you get over that one. And doing this inner work, this alchemical work, is just like that. All you have to have behind it all is just an intention. I am going to evolve myself. The people who are going to do this kind of evolutionary work on themselves are the people who are probably saying, I am here for a higher purpose. I don't know exactly what it is right now, but I know that I will not be able to bring it to fruition if I cannot get over all of this self-destructiveness. And that feeling, that intent for your own evolutionary purpose is strong enough to where you're willing to go into your own darkness. And I think it's for those people more than anyone, I think. Not everyone is going to make that, they're not going to all make that call.
Well, Colin, Melissa, I think that's a great point on which to end, even though there was a great deal more we could discuss. Once again, we've been talking about your book, Shadow Tech, Cracking the Codes of Personal and Collective Darkness. Now that you offer that for free, as I understand it, as a download, and it can be bought if people would like a print copy. So just share the information about your website with folk and anything else you'd like to put out there.
Yeah, so the book is at shadowtechbook.com, and yes, we do offer it for free as a PDF download. It's also available on Amazon in Kindle form and in print form. We also have a sister site called livinginthemovie.com. And then we also have a Facebook page called Living in the Movie. And we have that as a way of people sharing their own experiences of doing this kind of work or questions. Also, it has resources of some of the things that we've been discussing, any interviews that we've been doing. And the last thing is we are both musicians, and we're working on we are calling it an alchemical rock opera, and it's the O1 Experience, and the website is o1experience.com, and we will be having an EP out later this year and be setting up live performances for that.
Right, that's 01experience.com, and that's in its initial stages of fruition, and we'll probably have our EP out probably in about 3 months. And so keep an eye on that. And then we each have our own Facebook pages as well. If you go to the contact page of shadowtechbook.com or livinginthemovie.com, you can find our individual Facebook pages. And I think that's probably where we're most active daily, is on we do go onto our Facebook pages each day. And I think that's all the information you probably need.
Splendid. Well, once again, Colin, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us once again on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you,
Thank
Greg.
you, Greg. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.